I was working at a tourist information desk in Amsterdam when an American couple walked up to me. The man pulled out his phone and showed me a map. He pointed at the Netherlands and said, "So this is Holland, right?" I nodded. Then he pointed at Denmark and said, "And this is also Holland?" I had to explain that no, Denmark is a completely different country about 400 miles north. He looked confused and said, "But they both have windmills and bikes." That same week, a woman asked me how long the train ride to Paris was. I told her about 3 hours. She seemed shocked. 3 hours? But it's in a different country. I explained that Europe is much smaller than most Americans realize. She then asked if she needed to exchange her euros for French money when she got there. When I told her France also uses euros, she said, "Wait, so multiple countries share the same money? How does that even work?" My friend who works at a hotel in Prague has an entire collection of these moments. An American guest once asked him what language they speak in Prague. He said, "Czech." The guest replied, "No, I mean, what do regular people speak?" He had to explain that Czech people speak Czech. The guest genuinely thought Czech was just the formal government language, like Latin. Another time, someone asked him how to drive to Australia from Prague. Not fly, drive. When he explained that Australia is an island continent surrounded by ocean, the person said, "Yeah, but isn't there a bridge or something?" He had to pull up a world map and show that there are thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean between Asia and Australia. The person still seemed skeptical. But my favorite was the tourist who asked where the Berlin Wall was in Prague. When my friend said the Berlin Wall was in Berlin, Germany, the tourist said, "I thought all these old European cities had walls." He confused the concept of a medieval city wall with the Cold War Berlin Wall. He actually believed every European city had built a Berlin Wall. These aren't rare moments. They happen constantly. And I'm not sharing these to be mean. Most of these tourists are genuinely kind people. They're just working with a completely different mental map of the world. I've been collecting these moments for years across 3 continents. And if you're fascinated by how culture, education, and perception shape the way we see the world, this channel breaks down exactly that kind of context every week. Subscribe if that's your thing. American geography education focuses heavily on the 50 states. That makes sense, but it means many Americans reach adulthood with fuzzy knowledge about everywhere else. When they finally travel abroad, reality doesn't match their expectations. And that's when things get interesting. I was working as a tour guide in Barcelona when an American tourist asked me what language people speak in Spain. I said Spanish. She looked relieved and said, "Oh, good, because I learned Mexican in high school." I had to gently explain that Mexican isn't a language. Mexico speaks Spanish. She genuinely didn't know this. In her mind, every country had its own unique language. Spain spoke Spanish, Mexico spoke Mexican, Portugal spoke Portuguese, and Brazil spoke Brazilian. When I explained that Spanish is spoken across Spain and most of Latin America, she seemed almost upset. "So you're telling me I could have just learned Spanish once and used it in 20 countries?" Yes, that's exactly how it works. She'd apparently thought each Spanish-speaking country had developed completely separate languages that just sounded similar. A cruise ship worker in Venice told me about a passenger who asked what country Venice was in. He said Italy. The passenger said, "No, I mean, what country in Europe?" He explained that Italy is the country. Europe is the continent. The passenger had thought Europe was a country divided into states, like the United States. In his understanding, Venice was a state in the country of Europe. This same person later asked if he could use his euros in regular Italy, or if euros only worked in Venice. The worker had to explain that Venice is part of Italy. All of Italy uses euros. The passenger had apparently believed Venice was some kind of independent city-state with special currency rules. Like Vatican City, except he didn't know Vatican City existed. My cousin works at an airport in Dublin. An American traveler asked her what state Dublin was in. She said it's not in a state. It's the capital of Ireland. The traveler looked confused and said, "But I flew from London to Dublin. Those are both in England, right?" She had to explain that Ireland and England are two separate countries. The Republic of Ireland is completely independent. The traveler said, "Since when?" "Since 1922, she told him. He had no idea. What made it more complicated was that he'd somehow confused the Republic of Ireland with Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. When she tried to explain this, his eyes glazed over. The concept of one island containing two different countries, and one of those countries being part of a larger political union with a neighboring island, was too much information at once. He just nodded and walked away, looking more confused than before. A hotel receptionist in Vienna told me about an American guest who asked if Austria was the same as Australia. He said no, Austria is in Europe, Australia is near Asia. The guest said, "Then why are they spelled almost the same?" "That's actually a fair question." But then the guest said, "So, do you guys have kangaroos here or not?" The receptionist had to confirm that Austria, the European country, does not have kangaroos. Later, that same guest asked if Arnold Schwarzenegger was from Vienna. The receptionist said no, he's from a small village in southern Austria. The guest said, "Wait, I thought Arnold was Austrian?" "He is," the receptionist explained. Austria is a country. Vienna is just the capital city. Not everyone from Austria is from Vienna. The guest had assumed that Austria was so small that everywhere in Austria was basically Vienna. I had a student in my English language class in Berlin who was visiting from California. Nice guy, very curious. But during a geography discussion, he asked why Berlin was in Germany. I didn't understand the question. He clarified, "I thought Berlin was its own country because of the wall." He'd learned about the Berlin Wall in school, but had somehow concluded that Berlin was a separate nation that built a wall to keep Germany out. He had the entire Cold War geography backwards in his head. When I explained that Berlin was a city divided by a wall during the Cold War, with half in West Germany and half in East Germany, he said, "Wait, there were two Germanys?" Yes, from 1949 to 1990. He had never learned this. He knew about the Berlin Wall from Pink Floyd and history class, but nobody had ever clarified the actual political geography. In his understanding, Berlin was just a mysterious walled city somewhere in Europe. A bartender in Copenhagen told me an American asked him if Denmark was in Sweden. He said no, they're neighboring countries. The American said, "But you're all Scandinavian, right? Isn't that the same thing?" The bartender explained that Scandinavian refers to a cultural and geographic region, not a country. Denmark, Sweden, and Norway are three separate nations. The American seemed frustrated and said, "This is so confusing. In America, we just have states. That's the core issue. The American system of 50 states under one federal government creates a mental model that many Americans apply to the rest of the world. The idea that small neighboring regions can be completely independent countries with different languages, currencies, laws, and cultures is hard to process if you've never experienced it. This is the kind of pattern I trace constantly. How systems shape perception and why context collapse creates confusion. If you want more breakdowns like this that go beyond the surface story, you know what to do. I was working at a car rental agency in Rome when an American customer asked if he could rent a car for the day to drive to Greece. I asked when he needed to be in Greece. He said tonight. I had to explain that Greece is over 800 miles away through mountains and across water. There's no bridge. You'd need to take a ferry. He looked at his phone and said, "But on Google Maps, it looks like it's right next to Italy." This is the classic scale problem. On a world map or a zoomed-out phone map, countries look tiny and close together. Americans are used to driving 6 hours and still being in the same state. The idea that you can drive 3 hours in Europe and pass through 3 different countries is both amazing and confusing to them. He ended up asking if he could drive to Switzerland instead. I said that's possible, but it's still about 6 hours north through the Alps. He said, 6 hours? That's nothing. Then he paused and asked, "Wait, will my phone work in Switzerland?" I explained he'd need to check his international plan. He seemed annoyed that crossing a border meant dealing with different networks, regulations, and potential fees. A flight attendant friend of mine was working a transatlantic flight when a passenger asked if they'd be flying over any countries on the way to London. She said yes, depending on the route, they might fly over Canada, Greenland, Iceland, and Ireland before reaching England. The passenger seemed amazed. I didn't know there were countries in the middle of the Atlantic. She had to explain that the Atlantic Ocean has land masses in and around it, and flight paths often go north over them because the Earth is round, and that's actually a shorter route than going straight east. The passenger then asked how long it would take to drive from London to Africa. The attendant explained you can't drive directly because the Mediterranean Sea is in the way. You'd have to go through France, Spain, and take a ferry to Morocco. The passenger said, "How long would that take?" "About 3 or 4 days of driving," she estimated. The passenger was shocked. "I thought Europe and Africa were close." They are, relatively speaking. But close doesn't mean drivable in an afternoon. My friend who works at a train station in Brussels had an American tourist ask for a ticket to Rome for that afternoon. He said the fastest train would take about 11 hours with connections. She was shocked. 11 hours? Can't you just take the express train? He explained that was the express route. She couldn't believe it. In the US, we just fly. He pointed out that many Europeans do fly for long distances. But trains are popular because they're comfortable, don't require airport security, and drop you right in the city center. She then asked if the train went underwater to cross the Mediterranean. He explained that Brussels to Rome doesn't cross the Mediterranean. It goes through France and down through Italy. She'd apparently visualized Europe as a series of islands that required underwater tunnels to connect. The concept of a continuous landmass with trains running on regular tracks was not what she'd imagined. A tour guide in Athens told me about an American couple who wanted to do a day trip from Athens to Paris. He explained that Paris is about 800 miles away. The couple said, "Yeah, but we only have 3 days in Europe, so we need to see everything." He tried to explain that Europe contains 50 countries, and you can't see everything in 3 days. They seemed genuinely disappointed, as if he was being unhelpful rather than realistic. This happens because of how vacation time works in America. Many Americans get limited vacation days, so when they finally take a European trip, they try to cram in 10 countries in 2 weeks. They don't realize that quality matters more than quantity. Locals find it bizarre that someone would spend 12 hours traveling just to take a photo in front of a landmark and then leave. I was working at a tourist office in Munich when someone asked me how to get to Oktoberfest. I said, "You're in Munich. Oktoberfest is here." He said, "No, I mean the real Oktoberfest." I explained that Munich is where Oktoberfest originated and where the main celebration happens. He'd apparently thought Oktoberfest was a theme park that toured different cities, like a circus. He had no idea it was an actual traditional festival rooted in one specific location. He then asked if it would be faster to take a bus or walk to Oktoberfest. I said it depends where you're staying, but the festival grounds are large and well connected by public transit. He seemed frustrated by this answer. "Just tell me if it's walkable." In American terms, walkable usually means 5 to 10 minutes maximum. In European terms, 30 minutes is still considered walkable. We have different standards for what counts as walking distance. A hotel worker in Lisbon told me an American guest asked if he could walk to Morocco from Portugal. He said no, there's a strait between them. You'd need to take a boat or fly. The guest said, "But I can see Africa from here." The worker explained that just because you can see something doesn't mean you can walk to it. The Strait of Gibraltar is about 9 miles wide at its narrowest point. The guest still seemed to think there should be a bridge. I was teaching an English class in Paris when an American student asked me why French people don't just learn English since everyone speaks it. I explained that French people do learn English in school, but France is a French-speaking country, so French is the primary language. He said, "Yeah, but wouldn't it be easier if everyone just spoke the same language?" I agreed that would be easier, but that's not how the world works. He genuinely seemed to think this was a simple choice France was making to be difficult. This connects to geography because it reveals a deeper assumption. Many Americans grow up in a huge country where almost everyone speaks English. When they encounter other languages abroad, it feels like an obstacle rather than the natural state of the world. They don't have a mental framework for understanding that their experience is actually unusual. Globally, a museum guide in London told me about an American visitor who was surprised that British people spoke English. He'd apparently expected them to speak British as a separate language. When the guide explained that English originated in England, the visitor said, "Wait, so we're speaking your language?" "Yes, American English is a variant of British English." The visitor was mind-blown. He'd somehow thought America invented English, and Britain just happened to speak it too. This same visitor later asked why the museum had so many stolen artifacts from other countries. The guide explained that many artifacts were acquired during the British Empire period, which is now controversial. The visitor said, "When was the British Empire?" The guide said it lasted for centuries, reaching its peak in the 1800s and early 1900s. The visitor was shocked. "I thought Britain was always just this small island." The guide had to explain that. Britain once controlled about a quarter of the world's land and population. Waiter in Tokyo told me an American customer asked him if Japan was in China. He said no, Japan and China are different countries. The customer said, "But you're all Asian, right?" He explained that Asia is a continent with dozens of countries. Japan is an island nation east of China and Korea. The customer seemed annoyed and said, "This is too complicated." What's interesting is that Americans would never accept someone saying, "You're all North American, right?" So Mexico and the US are basically the same thing. But that's exactly the logic being applied to other regions. It reveals a gap where detailed knowledge exists about home geography, but everywhere else gets lumped into vague categories. I had a coworker in Sydney from Texas who was shocked to learn that Australia is both a country and a continent. She'd thought Australia was just a large island that was part of Oceania. I explained that Australia is technically both. It's the world's smallest continent, or the world's largest island, depending on how you define things. She said, "Why didn't anyone teach me this?" Maybe they did, and it didn't stick. Geography is one of those subjects where you forget details if you don't use them. She also asked if New Zealand was part of Australia. I said no, New Zealand is a separate country about 2,000 miles away. She'd assumed they were connected because maps often show them near each other. This is another scale issue. What looks close on a map might be thousands of miles of ocean in reality. A tour guide in Egypt told me about an American tourist who asked where the pyramids were in Morocco. He explained that the famous pyramids are in Egypt, not Morocco. The tourist said, "Aren't they both in Africa?" Yes, but Africa is a massive continent with 54 countries. The pyramids of Giza are specifically in Egypt. Morocco is about 2,500 miles away. The tourist seemed frustrated, as if Africa should be small enough to walk across in an afternoon. This reveals another pattern. Many Americans mentally shrink other continents while mentally expanding North America. In their mental map, you can't drive from New York to Los Angeles in a day because they understand that distance, but they assume you can easily travel between any two African or European countries because they don't have an intuitive sense of those distances. A bartender in Dublin told me an American asked him if Ireland was part of the UK. He said no. The Republic of Ireland is independent. Northern Ireland is part of the UK, but the Republic is separate. The American said, "So there's two Irelands?" Yes, the island of Ireland contains two different political entities. The American said, "That seems confusing." "It is confusing," the bartender agreed, "but That's the history. The American then asked if Irish people consider themselves British. The bartender said, absolutely not. Irish people are Irish. The Republic of Ireland fought for independence from Britain. Calling an Irish person British would be insulting. The American seemed surprised by how serious the bartender was about this. He hadn't realized it was a sensitive topic. A flight attendant told me about a passenger who was flying from New York to Paris. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the passenger asked how soon they'd be flying over the Eiffel Tower. The attendant explained they were still hours away from Paris. The passenger seemed confused and said, "But we've been flying for 3 hours already." Yes, and transatlantic flights take about 7 hours. The passenger had apparently thought Europe was much closer to the US. Later, that same passenger asked if the plane would land in England first and then drive to France. The attendant explained that they were flying directly to Paris, which is in France. The passenger said, "So we're skipping England?" The attendant confirmed that yes, they were flying to Paris, not London. The passenger seemed disappointed, as if he'd expected the plane to make a tour of European capitals along the way. I was working at an information booth in Amsterdam when an American tourist spread out a paper map of Europe on my desk. He pointed at different countries and said, "So, help me understand this. All these little countries each have their own government?" "Yes." "Their own laws?" "Yes." "Their own languages?" "Most of them, yes." "And their own money?" "Well, 20 countries use the euro, but others have their own currencies." He sat back and shook his head. "That's wild. In America, you can drive for 12 hours and still be in the same state using the same money, speaking the same language. Here you drive 3 hours and everything changes." I told him that's exactly right. That's what makes Europe interesting. He asked me if Europeans ever get confused traveling between countries. I said not really, because we grow up with it. It's normal to us. He said, "I guess it's like how you'd be confused visiting America." I agreed. I'd probably struggle with miles instead of kilometers, Fahrenheit instead of Celsius, and tipping culture. He laughed and said, "Yeah, the rest of the world thinks our measurement system is stupid." That moment was actually kind of nice. He realized that confusion goes both ways. Americans find European geography confusing because it's different from what they know. Europeans find American geography and culture confusing for the same reason. Neither side is stupid. We're all just working with different mental maps built from our own experiences. These collisions between mental maps and reality, that's what this channel is built on. Every week I find the moments where expectations meet the world, and what we learn when they don't line up. If that sounds like your kind of content, subscribe and come along for the ride. The funniest part is that these misunderstandings keep happening. Every summer, tourist season brings a fresh wave of Americans who are shocked that France and Germany are different countries, or that you can't drive from London to Rome in 2 hours, or that Portuguese people don't speak Spanish. And honestly, it's not malicious. Most of these tourists are excited to be traveling. They're curious about the world. They're just starting from a different baseline of knowledge. Geography education varies wildly depending on where you grew up and what you were taught. My last favorite story came from a hotel worker in Barcelona. An American guest asked him what the best way to get to Barcelona was. He said, "You're already in Barcelona." The guest said, "No, I mean the Barcelona in Spain." The worker said, "This is Barcelona, Spain." The guest looked around, confused, and said, "Wait, really?" He'd apparently flown to Barcelona, checked into a hotel, and still hadn't realized he'd arrived. That's the perfect ending. Sometimes you're already where you need to be. You just don't realize it yet. And that's kind of beautiful in its own way. These stories aren't about making fun of anyone. They're about the funny, awkward, human moments that happen when our mental maps don't match reality. And trust me, these stories never stop coming.